What we often misunderstand about narcissistic dynamics is that what appears to be love is, at a deeper level, an attempt to maintain control over an internal sense of instability. So when we talk about the moment the narcissist realizes you are never coming back, we are not describing a simple emotional loss. We are describing the collapse of a system and internal structure they have relied on, often unconsciously, to regulate their sense of self. You see, for someone operating from this wounded place, relationships are not experienced as mutual connections between two whole individuals. They are experienced as sources of regulation. The other person becomes, in a sense, an external nervous system. Your presence, your attention, your emotional responsiveness, these were not just appreciated, they were depended upon. And more importantly, they were managed. There was a structure, a pattern, a dynamic in which they knew how to pull you closer, how to create distance, how to provoke a reaction, how to restore their sense of significance when it felt threatened. When you finally step out of that dynamic, and when it becomes clear that this is not temporary, that you are not returning, not responding, not re-engaging, what disappears is not just the relationship. What disappears is their access to control. And this is where the real destabilization begins. Because control, in this context, is not about power in the obvious sense. It is about psychological survival. It is about keeping at bay a much deeper experience of inadequacy, shame, and fragmentation that often has its roots in early attachment wounds. This is something Gabor Maté speaks about with great clarity, the idea that many of our adult relational patterns are adaptations to early environments where our emotional needs were not adequately met. So what develops is not a healthy sense of self, but a compensatory structure designed to protect that vulnerable core. And within that structure, you had a role. Whether you realized it or not, you were part of the mechanism that helped them feel coherent, important, in control. So your absence is not neutral. It is disorganizing. Now, from the outside, you may not see this. In fact, quite often, you will see the opposite. You may see indifference, detachment, even a kind of dismissive confidence. But what is happening internally is far more complex. Because without you, they are left without one of their primary ways of managing their internal world. The strategies they used with you, those no longer work. And so there is a kind of quiet disorientation that sets in. It's important to understand that this is not the same as genuine grief. Grief involves the capacity to feel, to reflect, to integrate loss. What we are describing here is something more defensive. It is the experience of losing control over the very mechanisms that kept deeper pain out of awareness. And this is why your decision to leave truly leaves has such profound psychological impact. Not because it punishes them, not because it teaches them a lesson, but because it removes the illusion that they were in control of the connection. It confronts them, whether they acknowledge it or not, with a reality they have spent much of their lives trying to avoid, that other people are not extensions of them and cannot be controlled indefinitely. So when the narcissist realizes you are not coming back, what collapses is not just a relationship. What collapses is a carefully constructed sense of control over their inner world, and that is a loss they are far less prepared to face than the loss of you. And the deeper truth is this: when you reclaim your autonomy, you don't just walk away from them, you dismantle the illusion they depended on to feel whole. And once that structure of control begins to collapse, something even more sensitive is exposed beneath it. This is where we encounter what psychology often refers to as a narcissistic injury. It's not an injury in the physical sense, of course, but it is experienced with a kind of intensity that can feel just as threatening to the individual. Because what is being touched is not simply the loss of a personite, is the activation of a much older wound, one that predates you entirely. When you make the decision not to return, and when that decision becomes undeniable, it is interpreted not just as separation, but as rejection. And for someone whose sense of self is already fragile, rejection is not processed in a balanced or grounded way. It doesn't register as, this relationship didn't work. It registers as, there is something fundamentally wrong with me. Now, this is rarely conscious. In fact, much of their behavior is organized around avoiding that exact realization. As Gabor Maté often points out, what we call personality traits are frequently adaptations, ways of coping with environments where emotional safety was inconsistent or absent. If, early in life, a person learns that their worth is conditional, then they may begin to question their self-worth and their place in the world, that they are seen only when they perform, please, or control, then they begin to construct an identity around those strategies. Over time, that constructed identity becomes rigid, because it has to protect against the pain of feeling unseen or unworthy. So when you leave, and more importantly, when you do not come back, that constructed identity is challenged. Not directly, not in words, but in reality. Because your absence contradicts the narrative they have maintained that they are the one who decides, the one who holds power, the one who cannot be abandoned. And this contradiction creates tension. It creates what we might call a fracture between the image they hold of themselves and the experience they are now facing. But instead of integrating that experience rather than allowing it to reshape their understanding, they defend against it. This is where we begin to see the activation of defense mechanisms. Denial becomes one of the first. They may convince themselves that you will return eventually, or that your departure doesn't matter. And when denial isn't sufficient, projection often follows. The blame is externalized. You become the problem. You are labeled as disloyal, unstable, ungrateful, anything that allows them to preserve their internal narrative. There is also emotional withdrawal, a kind of shutting down that protects them from feeling the full weight of the injury. Because to feel it fully would require vulnerability, and vulnerability is precisely what their psychological structure has been built to avoid. So instead, what you often see is a performance of indifference, a distancing, sometimes even a rapid shift into new engagements, new distractions, new sources of validation. But beneath all of this, there's something unresolved, because the injury doesn't disappear, it is simply managed. And in many ways, your absence becomes a silent reminder of that injury. Not always in a conscious, reflective way, but in subtle, persistent ways that influence their behavior, their thoughts, their need to reassert control elsewhere. And this is where it becomes important to shift our perspective, because it can be tempting to interpret their reactions personally, to believe that their detachment means you meant nothing, or that their defensiveness reflects your worth. But in reality, what you are witnessing is not a clear reflection of you at all. It is a reflection of their internal struggle to maintain a sense of self in the face of perceived rejection. So the injury they experience is not really about losing you. It is about confronting, however briefly, the possibility that their carefully constructed identity cannot protect them from abandonment. And that is a possibility they are not equipped to sit with for long. And the deeper understanding here is this: when someone cannot face their own wound, they will do everything they can to avoid feeling it, but your absence ensures that, at some level, they no longer can. And once that injury has been activated, once the sense of control has fractured and the underlying wound has been touched, the psyche begins to look for immediate ways to restore balance. Not through reflection, not through integration, but through substitution. This is where we often see the emergence of what appears, on the surface, to be moving on. But if we look more closely, it is not movement forward at all. It is movement away from discomfort, from exposure, from the internal instability that your absence has revealed. What replaces you is not necessarily another person in the meaningful sense of the word. It is, more accurately, another source. A source of attention, of admiration, of affirmation, what in psychological terms is often described as supply. And this supply becomes essential because it helps reassemble the fragmented sense of self that was disrupted when you left. Now, this process can appear remarkably quick, sometimes even unsettlingly so. You may find yourself questioning the authenticity of what you shared, wondering how it is possible that someone can seem so deeply connected one moment and so easily redirected the next. But the answer lies not in the depth of the connection, but in the function it served. If the connection was primarily a means of regulation, then its replacement is not only possible, it becomes necessary. As Gabor Maté emphasizes in his work, when we do not develop the capacity to sit with our own emotional pain, we become dependent on external mechanisms to manage it. These mechanisms can take many forms: work, substances, achievements, or in this case, other people. And the more intolerable the internal state, the more urgent the need to find something or someone to alleviate it. But what is often overlooked is that these new connections are not built on presence. They are built on avoidance. They are shaped not by a genuine desire to know another person, but by a need to feel better, to feel restored, to feel intact again. And because of that, they tend to follow a familiar pattern of initial intensity, idealization, followed by gradual disillusionment. Not because the other person changes, but because the underlying wound remains unaddressed. In this way, the cycle continues. Each new connection becomes an attempt to solve a problem that was never truly understood, and each time it fails to do so, the individual is left with the same internal void they were trying to escape in the first place. What makes this particularly complex is that from the outside, it can look convincing. There may be displays of happiness, of confidence, even of fulfillment, but these are often surface-level expressions, maintained as part of the same protective structure that has always been in place. Because to admit that nothing has changed, that the same patterns are repeating, would require a level of self-awareness that threatens the very identity they are trying to preserve. So instead, the illusion is maintained, not only for others, but for themselves. And in that illusion, your absence is both erased and replaced, not truly processed, not integrated, but simply covered over. And this is where your understanding becomes important, because it allows you to see that what looks like replacement is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their inability to sit with the space you left behind. It is not that you were easily forgotten at, is that you were never engaged with in a way that could be sustained without control and validation. So when they seek someone new, it is not because they have healed, it is because they have not. And every new beginning built on the same foundation quietly carries the same unresolved ending. And the deeper truth is this: when someone replaces you without reflection, they are not moving on, they are running in circles, trying to escape a self they have never learned to face. And after the attempts to restore control, after the injury has been defended against, and even after the illusion of replacement has been constructed, something remains that is far more difficult to resolve, because what cannot be controlled, denied, or substituted has a way of persisting, and that is the psychological imprint of your absence. You see, when a dynamic like this is interrupted in a definitive way, when you do not return, when you do not respond, when you no longer participate in the familiar pattern, it creates a kind of disruption that the mind cannot easily organize around. The system they relied on, the rhythm they understood, the roles that were clearly defined, all of that is no longer available. And in its place is something unfamiliar: silence, unpredictability, and a lack of access. Now, for someone with a secure and integrated sense of self, absence can be processed. It can be reflected upon, understood, even grieved in a way that leads to growth. But for someone whose internal world is structured around control and avoidance, absence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a kind of unresolved tension, something that lingers, not because it is consciously examined, but because it has not been fully integrated. As Gabor Maté often emphasizes, what we do not process, we tend to carry. And we carry it not always in clear thoughts, but in patterns, in impulses, in subtle behaviors that reveal themselves over time. So even if they appear to have moved on, even if they are engaged elsewhere, there can still be a quiet preoccupation with what was lost, not in a sentimental sense, but in a structural one. Because your absence represents something unique. It represents a break in the pattern. It represents a moment where their usual strategies did not work. And that kind of disruption leaves a mark. This is where we sometimes see what could be described as indirect forms of attention, monitoring from a distance. Occasional attempts to reestablish contact, often subtle, sometimes ambiguous. Not necessarily driven by a desire for genuine reconnection, but by a need to resolve the tension that your absence created. It is less about you as a person, and more about what you represent, a part of their experience that remains unfinished. And what makes this particularly powerful is that your silence, your distance, your refusal to re-engage with these become forms of communication in themselves. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but clear. They signal that the dynamic has ended, that the access is no longer available, that the control they once relied on no longer exists. In a way, your absence begins to function as a boundary that cannot be negotiated. And for someone accustomed to influencing outcomes, to shaping interactions, this can be deeply unsettling, because it introduces a reality they cannot easily alter. But again, this is not always conscious. It doesn't necessarily lead to insight or transformation. More often, it leads to a kind of quiet fixation, something that sits in the background, unresolved, occasionally resurfacing in thoughts, in comparisons, in the way they relate to others moving forward. And this is why it is so important not to misinterpret these behaviors, because they can sometimes appear as signs of longing, of regret, even of realization. But more often than not, They are expressions of unresolved disruption, rather than genuine emotional clarity. Your role in this, however, is not to decode or respond. It is to understand. To recognize that what you are witnessing is not a hidden love story, but a psychological response to a pattern that has been broken. And the deeper truth here is that when you step out of a dynamic that once defined the interaction, you do more than remove yourself, you change the structure of the experience for the other person entirely. You introduce a silence they cannot easily interpret, and a boundary they cannot easily cross. And in that silence, something remains, not a connection, but an imprint, not a relationship, but a disruption. And the final understanding is this: when your absence becomes something they cannot control, it becomes something they cannot forget, and that is the quiet power of walking away.